Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a big one. It's one of the most critical, but maybe one of the most frustrating capabilities in the entire FinOps framework. We are talking about benchmarking. It sits inside that Quantify Business Value domain, and honestly, it can be a huge headache for anyone trying to really get a handle on their cloud spend.
It really can be.
Because what benchmarking is supposed to do is answer that one big question. How are we actually doing? How good are we, really?
Right.
It's the whole process of taking your efficiency metrics, your KPIs, and then comparing them against something else, either, against yourself a month ago or against one of your peers in the industry.
Mm-hmm.
And the goal isn't just to make a report about costs. It's about figuring out the value you're driving and making sure your FinOps work actually lines up with what the business is trying to do.
That alignment piece is everything.
Yeah.
And it all starts with a solid foundation. You can't benchmark anything until you know what you're measuring in the first place. So all the source material we looked at really hammers this home. The first step, the absolute prerequisite, is identifying and documenting good, meaningful KPIs. And this is key. They have to be tied back to your unit economics.
Got it.
Only after you do that can you start to establish those comparison points, both inside your own company, team against team, and then externally against the wider industry.
Okay, let's unpack that because I think this is where people get tripped up right away. We're talking comparison.
We are.
You can't just take Team A's $10,000 bill and compare it to Team B's $100,000 bill. I mean, that's completely meaningless.
Utterly meaningless, yeah.
The comparison has to be at the unit level. So cost per transaction or cost per active user or maybe cost per API call, that's how you start comparing apples to apples, right?
Precisely. That shift in thinking from just the total cost to the unit cost, that's the engine that makes all of this work. So formally, we define benchmarking as the comparison of those unit metrics and KPIs for the most important parts of your cloud value and optimization. And yes, it absolutely has that dual
So
nature.
external and external.
Right. You have the internal comparison, which you need to drive best practices and get everyone on board. And then you have the external one, which is what tells leadership if you're operating at, industry standard or maybe even better.
But the FinOps team can't just invent these metrics in a dark room somewhere. If they decide to measure cost per processed widget, but the engineering team can't actually isolate the data for a widget, the whole thing just fails on day one.
Oh, it's dead on arrival.
So who needs to be in that room to define metrics that are actually, actionable?
This is where that cross-functional collaboration becomes so important. The FinOps practitioners, they need to be embedded with leadership, with product, and with engineering. All three. Leadership points to the value drivers. They'll say, we need to focus on customer experience. Then product defines what that looks like as a number. Like, okay, customer experience for us is cost per daily active user.
And then engineering has to say if it's even possible to measure.
Exactly. Engineering confirms that the data you need can be measured, can be tagged, can be reported on. If you skip any one of those three inputs, your metric is either way too generic to be useful or it's just impossible to track. Let's stay on the internal benchmarking side for a second. This is the part that companies have the most control over, and it's probably the most powerful tool for making immediate changes.
Okay.
An effective internal program really stands on 4 pillars. You need a clear metric definition, transparent communication about what you're measuring, accurate data and dashboards, and supportive management that's really championing the whole effort.
That's a clear list. But if you look at those 4, where do companies usually fail? What's the most common point of failure when they're trying to move from just, tracking costs to actually changing behavior?
It's almost always the communication and the management support. Always. You can have the most beautiful, perfect data in the world. But if engineering thinks this is just a way for finance to punish them or cut costs, they'll either find a way to game the metric or, even worse, they'll just ignore it completely.
Which brings us to a really fascinating idea that came up in the source material. Gamification. Using incentive programs. It feels like a way to attack that engagement problem directly.
It absolutely works, but you have to be careful. It requires some finesse.
How so?
The key is to structure the incentives so they encourage the behavior you want without, accidentally creating a bunch of technical debt or instability.
Right.
For instance, putting a dev team on a leaderboard for the lowest unit cost. That's powerful. But you need guardrails. You have to make sure they're not getting that low cost by, say, under-provisioning their servers and risking an outage down the line. The focus has to stay on efficient value, not just cost-cutting.
That's a tricky balance to strike. So if internal benchmarking is about navigating internal politics, external benchmarking feels like it's about navigating, well, a total lack of trust between companies. Why is it so hard to compare yourself to your peers?
In a word, it's trust, or the lack of it. No company is going to just publish a detailed breakdown of their cloud pricing agreements or their specific usage patterns or, their secret sauce for how their architecture works.
It's a competitive disadvantage.
A massive one. Sharing that kind of detailed, sensitive info is a huge liability.
Okay, so if no one's sharing the really detailed stuff, how do we get any external information at all? Is external benchmarking just a dream, or are there places to start?
It's not a dream, but you have to rely on aggregation and community. The low-hanging fruit comes from aggregated data trends. You lean on trusted groups like the FinOps Foundation community, especially the enterprise membership groups where people can share informally under an NDA. You also use the aggregated state of FinOps survey data. You talk to large system integrators who see across many clients, and you talk to the cloud providers themselves.
The CSPs, how can they help?
They're surprisingly useful. They can't tell you what your direct competitor is spending, of course, but they can say something like, among all our customers running large Kubernetes clusters for banking apps, the average cost per transaction is Y.
Ah, so it's an anonymized, aggregated benchmark.
Exactly. And that summary data, even if it's not perfect, it gives leadership a vital, high-level sanity check.
That distinction is really important, the confidential sharing versus the aggregated data. It sounds like this is all about collaboration, not just running numbers.
That's it.
So let's jump into that, the who does what, because I think seeing how the different roles interact really brings this to life.
Absolutely. To make benchmarking work, you need clear roles. The main person, the core executor, is the FinOps practitioner.
The translator.
The translator, that's the perfect word. They take those high-level goals from the business and turn them into specific, measurable KPIs. And crucially, they're the ones designing the internal programs, managing the data, and communicating the results. They're the engine.
And the success of that engine depends entirely on the fuel it gets from leadership.
100%. The leadership persona has to champion the whole vision. They really have two jobs. Internally, they set the strategic KPIs that define what success even looks like, and they provide the budget for things like incentive programs.
And externally.
Externally, they're often the only ones with the right relationships to talk to peers at other companies, whether that's in a formal group or just a quiet CEO-to-CEO chat.
Okay, now for the friction point. Product and engineering. Their job is deliver its velocity. How does this benchmarking mandate not just slow them down?
It's about integration, not interruption. Product and engineering have to internalize these goals. They have to understand that success is now defined as velocity plus efficiency.
So it's part of their job, not an extra task.
Exactly. Their main function here is to provide accurate, timely data back into the system and then to actively work towards the benchmark targets. If an engineer is making a design choice, they should be able to see the cost impact of that choice almost immediately.
So if the big leadership KPI is cost per new customer, engineering's job isn't just to build the sign-up flow, but to build it in a way that's competitive on cost.
You've got it. And for that to work, they have to trust the data. If the FinOps practitioner hasn't worked with them to make sure the tagging is accurate, the benchmarks lose all credibility instantly. And then, of course, you have the support roles. Finance has to understand the goals so the budgets line up. And we should definitely leverage allied personas people from, supply chain or traditional IT.
Why them specifically?
They've been benchmarking non-cloud things for decades. They can bring proven methods for how to measure value and efficiency into the FinOps practice.
That's a great overview of the moving parts. Now, for anyone listening who's trying to build this, they need a map. And this is where it gets really interesting. Let's talk about the maturity framework. Crawl, walk, run, as a way to figure out where you are and where you need to go next.
Yes, the maturity journey is so helpful because it gives you clear goalposts. At the crawl stage, benchmarking is, it's basic. It's often reactive. You're probably using very broad KPIs like total monthly spend or maybe something super technical that doesn't really connect back to business value.
So what's the real consequence of being stuck in crawl?
You're flying blind. The comparisons are just informal. With the FinOps team, maybe pointing out which team is spending the most. The data isn't standardized. It's not transparent. You might save some money here and there, but you don't know why, and you can't repeat that success.
So crawl is basically having some numbers, but nobody really trusts them or uses them to change what they're doing. What does it look like when we get to the walk stage?
The walk stage is a huge leap. This is where structure starts to appear. You've identified a good variety of meaningful KPIs and unit metrics, and critically, there are now actual mechanisms for internal teams to compare their performance.
They can see the data themselves.
Exactly. Teams can start to self-serve this information from centralized dashboards. Ownership starts to shift from the FinOps team making reports to engineering teams monitoring their own efficiency.
That self-service piece feels transformative. What about on the external side, at the walk stage?
Externally, FinOps and leadership are starting to make some informal moves. They might share a few high-level numbers with some trusted peers, maybe at an industry event. It's strategic, but it's not systematic yet.
Okay, so now for the gold standard, the run stage. This is integrated, proactive FinOps. Can you give an example of what that curated set of KPIs looks like in a run organization?
Sure. In a run organization, the KPIs aren't just a list, they're a hierarchy. Leadership might track one big number, like a cloud efficiency score. But that score is made up of lower-level unit metrics from product, like cost per API session from one team and cost per GB stored from another.
It's all connected.
It's all connected, it's managed over time, and it's instantly accessible to everyone. The other big difference in the run stage is the formal integration of incentives. Your bonus, your annual review, it actually includes hitting these efficiency metrics.
And externally, they're not just waiting for reports anymore, they're part of the conversation.
That's right. A mature organization has established networks for sharing. They're active in places like the FinOps Foundation's enterprise groups or other industry working groups. They are both giving and getting intelligence, constantly refining their own KPIs based on what they're learning from the outside.
Wow, that connection between internal incentives and external participation, that really paints a picture of a self-sustaining process.
It is.
So let's pivot to the payoff. If we've done all this work, what are the real measurable signs of success for someone listening?
Well, success is when your benchmarking results become a real input to your business strategy. You've got targeted, documented KPIs that are informing decisions about the future, not just reporting on the past. Internally, success means the benchmarking process itself is highlighting your star performers, allowing you to find those pockets of excellence and replicate their practices across the whole company. It basically institutionalizes efficiency.
And externally, success is when leadership can confidently compare their performance against their peers, knowing they're using secure channels and protecting their data while still getting that strategic edge.
Exactly.
So just to recap the inputs and outputs here, the core input is unit economics. That's what you use to pick your KPIs. You also need good reporting and analytics to build those dashboards. And the output is the actual comparative insight you get from inside and outside your company.
And this brings us to probably the most important caveat of this whole conversation. As powerful as benchmarking is, you have to remember that every single company's cloud use is unique. Their architecture, their business goals. It's all different.
So benchmarking is a guide, not a rule book.
It's a yardstick, not a rule book. That's a perfect way to put it. It should only be one of the ways you assess your cloud's value and efficiency.
This brings up a really crucial management idea: action over perfection. If you know perfect external data is impossible to get, what's a decision that's better to make with the imperfect data you have now instead of waiting 6 months for better data?
That's a great question. A perfect example is your next big reserved instance or savings plan purchase. You could wait 6 months to get a slightly clearer picture of industry trends, but you'd miss out on 6 months of savings you could be getting right now. A successful company uses the imperfect internal benchmarks they have today, which tell them where their steady workload is, and combines that with the aggregated imperfect external data to make a commitment today.
So saving 15% now is better than waiting for a hypothetical 20% that might never come.
Exactly. Action with imperfect data is almost always better than inaction while waiting for perfection.
That is such a practical takeaway. Benchmarking, then, is really the thing that shifts the conversation from just measuring past costs to actively quantifying your value now and in the future. It's about finding that gap between where you are and where you could be.
Precisely. And that leaves us with a final thought for you to consider. Given that every organization is unique, but the need for external comparison is so critical, especially at that run stage, how can the industry balance this need for shared learning with the absolute necessity of protecting sensitive information? What other mechanisms beyond just formal memberships could we create to foster that transparency without compromising security?
A perfect question to keep thinking about as you optimize your own cloud strategy. Thanks for diving in with us. We'll catch you next time.